Joining us now in studio is Edward Kieswetter, Chief Executive of Alexander Forbes. Edward, just to get your insights as to how you heard the news, were you feeling, and your immediate response.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange and a mixed feeling. We knew that this day was inevitable, and yet when it occurred, nothing could have prepared us for that sense of loss and that sense of grief and sadness. And we were together as an EXCO team having a dinner last night when we heard the news, and immediately, obviously, it changed the mood. And so, yes, I think for a long time we will, and we should allow ourselves to mourn and to grieve the loss of one of our greatest fathers, and certainly, for me, the principle of our democracy.
Of course, Edward, once you left the dinner and went home, you probably on the drive, and as you got to that comfortable space, really had a time to an opportunity to reflect on the personal meaning of Nelson Mandela in your own life. If you could share with us some of those thoughts that you were grappling with on the drive home.
You know, one of the things that have, not only last night, but have often troubled me is how easily we can forget about the lessons we have learned from great leaders, and in our case, Madiba. And I wrestle with this and ask myself, how do we leverage, how do we capitalize on the wonderful lesson, the legacy that this great leader leaves us with? And I am sure that he would not want us to praise his name, but rather to follow in his deeds. Madiba is one of those leaders who epitomizes for me that leadership is not a title. You don't become a leader because you're ordained into a title, but rather he epitomized it through his attributes, through his values that reflected in his behavior. He was a congruent person and a great leader.
Edward, what does this mean for corporate South Africa? It's a volatile time in the South African industry at the moment. We've got labor on separate sides, government not cooperating with the private sector, and there's a trust deficit, if we could use that word. Are there any lessons, perhaps, that we could all learn from a leader like Madiba?
Yes, I remember the first time that I met him, and he shook my hand and looked into my eyes. I will never forget that. For me, it was as if time stood still. And Madiba had a way of talking with you, not at you. And very often I'm saddened by the current dynamics of our political and economic society, where we shout at each other. We don't sit down and connect with each other as people. And for me, that first meeting with Madiba, for those few moments, it felt as if I was the most important person to him. And I think if we as leaders can exert that influence, that those whom we talk to, we can connect with them as human beings. For me, that is the wonderful inspiration and the lesson that Madiba, as not only a leader, but as a communicator, his greatness came from his humanity.
It's almost eerie how the voices keep reinforcing this this narrative of how he made you feel as if you were the only person who mattered in that particular moment. But perhaps let's look at a South Africa post-Mandela. Do you think that this is a psychological shift in the history of South Africa, and that we are now perhaps starting a new era altogether?
I think it's a symbolic shift, not necessarily a psychological shift. The importance and the significance of knowing, even though completely debilitated as sadly he was in this last few months, just the sense of comfort we drew from the fact that somewhere in Houghton, or somewhere in Kunu, our father was, and he was breathing and he was with us. The fact that he has passed on leaves a void that is going to be difficult to fill. I think, though, that the strength of his legacy will supersede, and it will become ingrained in our society. And for me, even though Madiba's journey on earth among us have ended, the work that his legacy compels us to do commences in earnest today.
Profound words and emotive insights being shared there. Thank you so much to Edward Kieswetter, Chief Executive of Alexander Forbes.